I was talking to an analyst yesterday who was worried that, if there is a ceasefire and Hezbollah is struggling for its own survival, it might lead to what everyone always is terrified about, a repeat of the Civil War.
I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Battle Lines.
We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
President Zelensky has for the first time acknowledged that his forces are conducting a cross-border offensive inside Russia.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
If I had not moved my head at that very last instant, the assassin's bullet would have perfectly hit its mark.
It's Friday, September the 27th. The Israeli Defense Forces top general has told his troops to be ready to enter Lebanon to fight Hezbollah on their own turf for the first time since 2006. At the same time, American diplomats are rushing to broker a ceasefire. As the Middle East stands on the brink of unlikely peace or an even bloodier war, I spoke to the Telegraph's Adrian Blomfield in Beirut and photographer Heathcliff O'Malley in Tel Aviv, who told me about the fears of ordinary people on either side of the border. So events on the Israeli-Lebanese border are moving incredibly fast. On Wednesday night, the head of the Israeli Defense Forces, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, told soldiers at the border, "You can hear jets overhead. We've been striking all day. This is both to prepare the ground for your possible entry and to continue degrading Hezbollah." And then on Thursday morning, we got reports that the United States was hopeful of a 21-day ceasefire coming in. We are either on the brink of a ground war in Lebanon or some kind of ceasefire. I'm joined now by Heathcliff O'Malley, who is in Tel Aviv, and Adrian Blomfield, a correspondent in Beirut, I believe.
That's right, yes.
That's right. Adrian, could we start with you, since you are in Lebanon, and if there's going to be a war, that's where it's going to be. As far as you understand this morning, where are we?
Well, morning, I think, as you say, we're either on the cusp of peace or on escalation. Things have been a little bit more optimistic. Beirut is normally a party city, but in the past few days, restaurants have been closing, cafes have been closing early, people have been staying at home. There's a great deal of nervousness. Today, there are a few more people in the cafes. People are a little bit more optimistic, at least the residents of Beirut. Those who fled from the south tend to be less so. I've been speaking to a Shia family who have actually been staying in our hotel. And they had a sort of fairly terrifying encounter. The house next to them was bombed. The man in the family was wounded when glass shattered and injured his arm. And they wonder, even if there is peace, what they would be going back to. And I think they're skeptical because obviously there's always been a lot of talk of a ceasefire in Gaza, which hasn't actually happened. So I think they're rather skeptical. And of course, they lived through the same thing. The villages south of the Litani River in southern Lebanon lived through the same thing in 2006. That war carried on for about 5 weeks, 34 days. And so I think people feel a little bit surprised that things would be coming to a head so quickly. But of course, one of the differences between now and then is the ferocity of the Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon. During those 34 days in 2006, just under 1,200 people were killed according to the official death toll, whereas we had nearly half that number being killed in Monday alone, when Israel unleashed the heaviest bombardment of the 21st century anywhere in the world, according to experts. So it is a different level of magnitude, but maybe one of the things that's happening is that the Israeli intention was to have something that was short and sweet. There's been this talk of achieving de-escalation through escalation. So the question is whether Hezbollah has been deterred sufficiently that it would be willing to talk about a ceasefire. That's a big if.
Thank you very much for that, Adrian. I want to come back to you and talk about your impressions of the current state of Lebanon. And of course, you reported that war in 2006. So it'll be fascinating to hear kind of your reflections on how things have changed since then. Heathcliff, if I could come to you, you're in Tel Aviv. You've been in Jerusalem for a week or two, I think, on a reporting job. I was wondering if you could, kind of bring us up to date with the feeling or the latest developments inside Israel today, and just give us a sense of, I mean, what is the mood down there regarding this current escalation in the north? Because the last war there cast a bit of a shadow in Israel?
Well, whilst a warm breeze may be rolling off the Mediterranean onto the beaches here, I think there's a sort of a growing wind of discontent amongst the people in Israel itself. With the continuing war in Gaza and now the move against Lebanon. I mean, I've mainly been speaking to hostage families, so that's really where I'm coming from. I mean, I've spoken to a few other people, but it's mainly been hostage families. And for them, they just feel that this is another diversion away from getting their relatives back, and that it's, just causing more and more problems. And I mean, that's been, growing ever since early September when the 6 hostages were executed. And that was a big turning point for families here. And for them, at least, it's come to this stage now where they just really don't feel like the government are serious about dealing with Gaza. And so, for them, it's like, well, hang on a minute. Why are we starting, another conflict up in the north? But then others will say, well, you've got 80,000 plus displaced people in northern Israel. Just before the operation was announced, I was speaking to people closer to the Knesset who were talking about the need for a buffer zone to enable people to go back. So I guess for the government and for Netanyahu, having these people unable to move back to their homes is a big problem. And maybe they're hoping that if they can move them back, then that might sway public opinion who are fed up with what's been happening in Gaza. I think something like 70% almost of the population now no longer think that Bibi should be in charge. They're in a sticky situation, but around Tel Aviv, everything just goes on as normal. I mean, every night everyone's jogging and playing volleyball and dancing on rooftops. It's really quite surreal. But I guess as we know in Kiev, people carry on, don't they, in times of war. So it doesn't necessarily mean they don't care, but considering where Adrian is and this mounting death toll, which said is strikingly higher than the last war, it's bizarre being here, and life sort of continues as normal in around Tel Aviv. I mean, we had one alarm yesterday morning from a missile, and that's been the first one in months.
Just an alarm, because I was just about to ask you about that. I saw there was a report that I think I heard on the radio on the World Service that Hezbollah had fired perhaps its first ever rocket at Tel Aviv. I wasn't sure if it had hit Tel Aviv, or have you heard the Iron Dome in action? Is it one of those periods when you can just hear these rocket intercepts going off above your head in Tel Aviv, that central part of Israel, or not?
It's not like, last year when we were here, it was, daily. And the alarm yesterday went off at about 6 a.m. and I didn't see anything, but then I saw reports immediately afterwards of, and saw the photograph of one sort of vapor trail in a puff in the sky of this one missile that had been taken out. I guess in Tel Aviv and closer to the border as well, and around Haifa, they do have the luxury of the Iron Dome system, which seems to be fairly effective. But, that was one missile. What would happen if Hezbollah fired multiple at a time? But then I was talking to somebody else the other day who's a sort of, he's an expat engineer, chemical engineer, and he was saying, look, it's incredibly difficult for Hezbollah to fire these big rockets, the long-range ones, because they have to keep all of the parts in separate locations because of the danger of keeping it all together. If you've got the fuel and explodes the warheads and everything else too close together, you can get really unstuck. So then trying to bring all of that together, fuel it, position it, aim it, fire it, takes a long time. So he was like, well, look, once they start moving these things around, they're going to get hit. And so just because they've got these big, sort of super weapons doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to utilize them as freely as they can their smaller rockets.
That's an incredibly interesting point, because, of course, one of the things we hear again and again is about the size of Hezbollah's rocket arsenal and, the threat that it potentially poses to Israel, and also the deterrent effect that it might have. So that's a really interesting point to make and to note. Adrian, I know you've been doing some reporting around Lebanon about kind of just the state of the place and how we got into this. And we should remind listeners, of course, the war we're talking about, strictly speaking, isn't a war between Israel and Lebanon. It's a war between Israel and Hezbollah. And because of the state of play there, that can get a little bit blurred. Could you just tell us a bit about, Hezbollah's role in the country and whether you think that this current escalation, especially given the scale of ferocity, as you were saying, of the Israeli response, the pager attacks, the walkie-talkie attacks, the airstrikes, whether you think Hezbollah are in a fairly strong position or whether they're actually on the ropes right now?
I mean, it's a complex but good question. I think one of the differences between 2006, Hezbollah's popularity initially was because it was solely a militia. It was the only one under the peace deal that ended Lebanon's civil war in 1990 that was allowed to keep its weapons because it was seen as a resistance movement that was fighting the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon in 2000, which ended in 2000. And because Hezbollah was seen as successful in pushing the Israelis out of South Lebanon, the movement became very, very popular. And it retained some of that popularity in 2006, but there have always been members of Lebanese society who have hated Hezbollah. Lebanon is deeply divided on confessional lines, on sectarian lines. So Hezbollah is Shia. The Shia community, which was once the smallest, has been marginalized for decades, for centuries, really, within Lebanese society, and Hezbollah stood up for them. So Hezbollah has always been very, very popular among the Shia, less so among Christians, who were once in the majority. Their numbers have been falling proportionately, and also very unpopular among Sunni Muslims. If we look at society in Lebanon, it's probably divided roughly along a third, although, of course, we have to bring in Druze and other members of the community. So Hezbollah is not popular, and there are many reasons for that. Over the years, Hezbollah has entered politics, and it has become, in some ways, engaged in gangsterism. There have been a lot of targeted assassinations of politicians of other tribes that have been blamed on Hezbollah. Hezbollah used the port for smuggling, and so a lot of Lebanese feel that big port explosion that I'm sure lots of your listeners will remember from 4 years ago, that huge explosion that devastated a lot of Beirut. People hold Hezbollah responsible for that because they allowed an atmosphere of lawlessness in the port. And the investigation into that has been repeatedly stymied. So when Hezbollah started launching its rockets after October the 7th in solidarity with Hamas, there was a lot of anger among non-Shia members, possibly among some Shia as well. It's harder to speak to Shia Lebanese more openly, but certainly among ordinary Lebanese, there was this sense that, yet again, we are being dragged into a war that is not of our own making. And there was a great deal of resentment. There's possibility that that's changed slightly. Speaking to some non-Shia MPs, as I have been in recent days, they say that the Israeli attacks, from the pagers and the walkie-talkies to the ferocity of the strikes, is helping to re-legitimize Hezbollah in the eyes of Lebanese society. So domestically, their position might become stronger. Now, that's not a universal opinion. Some MPs and some others I've spoken to say that that's not the case, and they believe that this indeed actually might be the beginning of the end of Hezbollah. We'll need to, that's a big shout, that's a big call to make. We'll need to say that. But the other thing that we should point out is that in the process of, if you want to call it, in the process of liberating southern Lebanon, Hezbollah also captured the Lebanese state, and the Lebanese state is now too weak to control Hezbollah. Hezbollah is also a political party. It is in parliament, but it also has a lot of parliamentary allies, so it's quite dominant within a sector of Lebanese politics, and other institutions like the army are simply too weak to counter Hezbollah. So it is a militia that has responsibility for aspects of the state, but most people are too scared to stand up to Hezbollah. So when there are assassinations, you've seen Christian parties initially blaming Hezbollah and then rolling back. And you look at the army is much, much weaker than Hezbollah. And one of the things that I find extraordinary is that in the financial crisis, which I'll briefly talk about because I don't want to go on for too long, but in the financial crisis which has affected Lebanese society, it's also affected the Lebanese army, whose salaries have shrunk dramatically. The Americans and the Qataris had to step in to pay those salaries. So demoralized is the Lebanese army and so short of cash that they're offering helicopter rides to tourists to make money. So it's not an outfit that can counter the much stronger, better paid members of Hezbollah. Although, of course, Hezbollah itself has taken quite a battering in the past week.
I've done a little bit of reporting, mostly from the Israeli side on this, just over the phone, really. And the feeling there seems to be this mixture of brash confidence that the IDF can smash anything and will, really can kind of put Hezbollah on the ropes if they need to do it, combined with a kind of maybe slightly contradictory acknowledgement that this could be very tricky and difficult. But also, I think, and we're seeing it officially from the rhetoric from the army, from Benjamin Netanyahu and so on, that there's a sense that they're going to have to escalate this war and possibly cross the border. I'm wondering whether you have been able to speak to Hezbollah or anybody close to them for a sense of what they're thinking or what their kind of strategy is here.
Well, I've been speaking to people who are close to Hezbollah. It's slightly complicated, but you essentially have commentators who are familiar with the inside thinking of Hezbollah and allowed to speak to people like me. And very much echoing some of the things that were said, have been said in Iran, is that there was this feeling that Israel wants to suck Hezbollah into all-out war because then the Americans will be forced to come in and Hezbollah will no longer be fighting against Israel. So that's one of the reasons why they don't want to get into all-out war, they say. The other is a realization that not all of Lebanese society wants that. And then thirdly, that there is a belief that Hezbollah would be most effective by bogging Israel down in a long, protracted, attritional campaign. So they think that they wouldn't win a short, sharp confrontation. And that's one of the reasons why they are hanging back. Whether you believe that or not is another question. And I would say until now it has been reasonably effective. Heathcliff talked about the Israeli need for a buffer zone, which has always been there. That's the reason why Israeli forces were in South Lebanon in the first place all of those years ago. But one of the ironies is that in the past year, Hezbollah has effectively created a buffer zone in northern Israel by getting all of those 60,000 residents have been forced to leave the area. So Hezbollah has had the upper hand. The Israelis are now trying, as they openly say, to shift the balance of power in the north. So far, it's been incredibly effective. We've seen the decapitation strikes that have wiped out a huge number of the leadership. A lot of the most experienced fighters were the ones who were carrying pages. They are also out of the picture. Thousands of them potentially out of the picture. So it is weakened. But one of the things we haven't seen, and we don't know, Hezbollah either hasn't or either cannot or will not fire the bulk of its missiles. Now, Heathcliff talked about one of the reasons for that. But one of the things that has always been assumed is that if Hezbollah fired its rockets, its sophisticated targeted rockets, in large numbers, it would overwhelm those Iron Dome defenses. So we don't know whether that is something that might still happen. And if that was the case and this deterrence doesn't work, then Israel would be forced into some kind of ground operation. And I saw that firsthand in 2006. That's not something that will be easy to mount.
Thank you very much. I really want to come to that. I'm going to save it up because I actually want to move the conversation onto kind of historical reflections in a way, or just kind of impressions. You're both very experienced. Well, Heathcliff is a photographer. You're a reporter. I know you've worked together in the past. Heathcliff, if I could come to you, I'm really interested in just getting into your sense, your impression of what's changed on the ground in Israel after about a year of this conflict. I know you flew in not long after October 7th last year. You've been around. I think one of the things with you guys, with the photographers, if I may say so, is that you have this kind of opportunity to think while, we writers are kind of bashing stuff out and so on. And I think sometimes you're able to kind of stand back and give an interesting, thoughtful kind of view of things. I was wondering, from your perspective, what has a year of this conflict, mostly obviously concentrating in Gaza, now moving to the north, what do you think that's done to Israel in I don't know, through your eyes?
I'd say one of the advantages of being a photographer is sometimes you can talk to people in a way that journalists can't, because that you're not taking notes. They know that you're not quoting them. And so you might be able to just have a little bit of a chat on the side. I used to do that with soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, where they wouldn't speak to the reporter, but I could sit and go and have a cigarette with them, and they would mutter about things that they just wouldn't do otherwise. And when I was at the protest on Saturday night, which is this weekly event, where you've got the hostage families, the anti-war and the anti-government protesters all together now in one big group, and they've kind of been galvanized. They've come together even more so since early September. And I bumped into somebody that I saw last year who was the relative of some young dual national British girls that were killed on October 7th along with their mother. And when I met him a year ago, he was very much, had this sense that regardless of what's happened, we should still go in before, regardless of the negotiations, we need to go in to Gaza. And speaking to him almost a year later, he's completely changed. He's now feels that the war has unachievable aims, and that he and others have been working together, and this includes former people in the military and stuff, working together to present an alternative peace plan to the one the government has brought forward, because they just don't feel the government's willing. And that's been an ongoing theme since last year, talking to experts then who felt that, the government's main priority wasn't the hostages. So, and then I was talking to somebody else who felt very disillusioned with what was happening and was saying, look, these are minority views. I'm not saying this is how everybody feels here. The country's divided, and the majority of people will still think that they need to defend themselves. There are hostile entities on all their borders, etc. But this other person was saying to me, look, we have been told since we were at kindergarten that everybody hates us and everybody wants to kill us, and we need to move on from that. And they were seriously so fed up now they were considering emigrating to Europe. So there is this difference of opinion. I think a year of the war, and I think it's difficult sometimes for people in the UK to understand how deep the hurt and trauma is from October 7. For them it's just enormous. And I was in the Holocaust Museum the other day, and they had a batch of young National Service recruits who were all being taken around, and once again being told about what happened, back in the 30s and 40s in Eastern and Central Europe and the Holocaust. And so this continues, and October 7th was just built on that. So you do have this sense here that that they need to do something. So the buffer zone. I guess I don't know how many people agree of what's about the new operation in Lebanon, but for the people that have had to leave their homes in the north, it must be very difficult. But there are a number of people here that also are utterly disgusted with what's happened over the last 11 months and the death toll in Gaza. For them, it's difficult to reconcile the two, that this has gone on for so long. But then I was walking along with some protesters who were putting up these stickers of Bibi everywhere, with like a bloody red hand over his face, and they were utterly opposed to the war, utterly opposed to the government, probably the most anti-government people I'd met. And as they were walking along, this old lady was parking her car and she started shouting at them, and I was like, what was that about? Was she telling you off? And he said, oh yeah, she's pro-Bibi. So there's this divide here. And I guess as this operation goes well, it's probably going to be fairly popular whilst it's just airstrikes. But what happens in Israel once ground troops have to go in again? People are suffering here. You might see them jogging along the beach or playing volleyball or in cafes or in nightclubs, but you don't know how many of them, men and women, have been having to fight over the last year, have lost relatives. So underneath this sort of veneer of a Mediterranean life, that there is another side to things. And I think Netanyahu's flying to New York this morning, and you've got this United States-led peace proposal for a 21-day ceasefire. And I was talking to somebody earlier who's a bit closer to the government than I am, and he said, well, this is something that they will be exploring seriously, and perhaps what they'll go for is, okay, we'll agree to a 7-day ceasefire, possibly in the hope that Hezbollah will say, no, but to give Hezbollah a chance to agree, but also give Israel the authority to carry on in strength if there is no agreement at all. I hope that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. Thank you very much, Heathcliff. Adrian, listening to that, you were the Telegraph's Jerusalem correspondent for some years. What's your reaction to that? Any thoughts on what Heathcliff just said?
I think that, and yes, it's been a while now. That was from 2009 to 2012. There were certainly always divisions within Israeli society. My Israeli landlord used to join the Sheikh Jarrah protests, as they were known, sort of in every week, heading off to denounce Israeli settlements in the West Bank. I would say that sort of Israeli left felt like it was shrinking back then. The Peace Brigade was shrinking back then, and I assumed that it would have done so even more now, although, of course, I've not been in Israel since October the 7th, and I don't know to what extent that dial has been shifted. And obviously, Netanyahu has got his popularity issues, given everything that's happened and those intelligence failings. And perhaps he is looking to this campaign in Lebanon to try and restore his image, because, of course, Hezbollah was always seen as a far more formidable Iranian proxy, a far more formidable fighting force than Hamas. And at the moment, Hezbollah at least seems to be on the ropes. So Israeli intelligence has regained something of its reputation from those pager and walkie-talkie attacks, from the decapitation strikes. And if this is a short, sharp campaign that forces Hezbollah to back down, then that will obviously play well politically, Benjamin Netanyahu will be hoping. But, that's still a big question. And if we end up in a grand campaign, then the picture changes and the issues change.
Well, let's talk about a ground campaign, because I know you saw the last one. I interviewed an IDF officer who fought in the last ground war in Lebanon in 2006, and I must say he was just furious to this day with, as he saw it, Ehud Olmert, the Prime Minister of the time, and the High Command's handling of that war. He seemed to feel that the soldiers who had fought it had kind of been let down. It's got this reputation as a war that the IDF kind of botched, and in a way that Hezbollah emerged from triumphantly. What do you remember about that war? What can you tell us about it?
Well, I would say yes. I remember that sentiment being very much echoed, because we accidentally ended up crossing the front line. I was in southern Lebanon, in the villages of southern Lebanon where the Hezbollah positions were. And on the final day of the campaign, as the ceasefire was announced, we'd gone to a village called Gandourieh, where Hezbollah were holding, and they didn't allow us in initially, but we later circled back and we managed to get into the village. And that was the scene of the last stand of the war. So some Israeli commandos from the Nahal Brigade had been dropped into the village, and then Israeli tanks and infantry had been coming up the hill, and it had been, not to put too fine a point on it, it had been a slaughter. It was either 17 or 19 Israeli soldiers who were killed. And this is one of the things that about that war, is that Israel hadn't realized the strength, I don't think, of Hezbollah's rocket capacity back then, which was only 15,000 strong in comparison with perhaps 150,000 today. So 10 times that amount. But Hezbollah's Cornet anti-tank missiles had done an awful lot of damage. I think they were damaging tanks at a rate of 20% of rockets fired, I think the statistic was. But we got through, and so we were in this village, and it had been abandoned. Hezbollah had withdrawn, so we were sort of in no man's land. And, we were walking through, the place had been utterly destroyed. And what was striking was just the amount of ordnance had been left. We found all of these cornets, but other types of missiles, which very blatantly said on them, supplied by KBP Chula, which is a Russian state-backed munitions maker, supplied to the Syrian Ministry of Defense. Syria had been denying that they were supplying Hezbollah missiles, and Russia, of course, denied that their munitions had ended up on the battlefield as well. That clearly wasn't the case. And then we started speaking to guys who we thought were Hezbollah in Arabic, and we were essentially captured by these Israeli soldiers from the Nahal Brigade. And unfortunately, we'd also picked up a Hezbollah radio from a dead fighter so that we could work out where the Hezbollah guys were. So it was slightly embarrassing because they were wondering who the hell we were because we had a Hezbollah radio with us. But we managed to talk our way out of the situation. And we had a long chat because these guys were furious. They were exhausted. They hadn't anticipated the scale of this. It had been a dreadful, terrible battle up the hill. And then suddenly they'd been told after these 17 soldiers had been killed that they'd got up there and there was a ceasefire. So they were wondering, why is it that we have lost all of these men to take this worthless village for absolutely no reason? So I think they really did feel that they had gone in to do a job and hadn't done it. Now, you could also say that the peace deal did result in the key resolution, UN Resolution 17, was supposed to force Hezbollah to pull back positions behind the Litani River and recreate that buffer zone. And it has resulted in calm for 18 years. But of course, during that period, Hezbollah has rearmed and is or was supposed to be a much more formidable force. So I think it would be a very, very tricky campaign in those hills because Hezbollah knows the terrain. It's very hilly. They've got tunnels where they're storing their ammunition. And of course, unlike in Gaza, they can be far more easily resupplied. Hezbollah controls the Lebanese border with Syria, so it can be resupplied that way. So it would be a different complexion to the war in Gaza. But maybe it won't come to that. We've got to see how Hezbollah now responds because it has taken an absolute hammering. And I think one of the things that Hezbollah will be very worried about is how deeply it has been infiltrated. Because clearly when you've got, maybe 16 senior members of battlefield commanders were killed in the strike last week, more have been killed this week. You had Fuad Shukur being killed in a strike in July. And a lot of those were from those special forces brigades who are designed to infiltrate Israel and try and take the battle behind enemy lines, perhaps even to attempt a repeat of what happened on October the 7th in northern Israel, although, of course, the civilians aren't there, and that's one of the reasons why they're not there. But that the tactical, strategic capacity, the leadership capacity has been severely weakened. And so that's one of the reasons why Hezbollah may have to consider a ceasefire that it might not want because of the potential reputational damage that it would do both to the movement and to Hassan Nasrallah's leadership within its own Shia constituency and across the broader Middle East.
Thank you very much for that, Adrian. I just wanted to, it might sound a little bit kind of kumbaya, but we tend to talk a lot about, armies and divisions and various kinds of anti-tank rockets and strategies and victories and ceasefires and this thing. And the danger of that is that we lose sight of the fact that people are living in the midst of all this. And when these things happen, no matter where it is in the world, there is generally absolutely horrendous civilian suffering. Adrian, I wanted to ask you actually about, in 2006, what did that mean for the civilians there, and what's it likely to mean in Lebanon now, especially since the Israelis they claim that all these rockets are hidden in mosques and schools and residential houses, and therefore they're going to have to hit them.
Well, I think that's the thing. Everyone fled in 2006. There was a lot of damage. Although a lot of houses were very quickly rebuilt after the war, there was a big international support to allow that to happen. People are questioning whether there will be that same resolve with international donor fatigue, given the war in Ukraine, given crises elsewhere. But I think the scale of devastation in the south is already bigger because that war took place over 34 days. But this campaign has already been going on for nearly a year. So villages right on the blue line, the Israeli and Lebanese border, according to aid workers I've spoken to, have already recorded levels of up to 90% destruction. So Lebanon is really suffering. The scale of the economic crisis is astonishingly deep. It's the deepest economic depression anywhere in the world for possibly 170 years. So you've got people already living in the south who have nothing. They've moved in with family members who also have nothing and are now trying to support even bigger families. So, you've got all of that to take. Lebanon has already been laid low by its own problems, by its own sectarian problems, of which Hezbollah is a major significant part. It's now got this, and it's going to be absolutely terrible. And for quite a long time, even if there is a ceasefire for those elsewhere and for the rest of Lebanon, I think there's fear. I was talking to an analyst yesterday who was worried that, if there is a ceasefire and Hezbollah is struggling for its own survival, it might lead to what everyone always is terrified about, a repeat of the civil war. And I know this sounds like a cliche, but Lebanon is an amazing country. Most people who come here fall in love with it because it's got ruins. It's got, the old cliche that you can ski in the mountains in the morning and then swim in the Med in the afternoon. It's got these lovely little bars and restaurants, a very cosmopolitan, modern-looking society in which religion is becoming less and less a factor. 50% of people, according to polls now, say that religion is only somewhat or not important to them. So it's becoming more modern-looking, but it's held prisoner both by its sectarian past and by Hezbollah. And I think, that's sort of the age-old tragedy. There's the famous book by Robert Fisk, Pity the Nation. And that's still the case. Lebanon is a wonderful country that has just been laid low by repeated blows. And this is another one of those things. And it's just something that is tragic to see.
Adrian, thank you so much. Heathcliff, I know you're coming to the end of your latest assignment in Israel. Would you like the very final words on this?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, I mean, as we were saying before, it was, to come back 11 months on and see the same people still waiting for news about what happened to their families on October 7th is heartbreaking. But, one has to be careful because obviously what's happened here pales in comparison to what's been happening in Gaza and now possibly in Lebanon as well. And, every death is a tragedy, and try to stay objective with these things. And it's heartbreaking seeing what's going on and that we're still stuck in this cycle of violence. And if I am allowed an opinion, I just sincerely hope that, something will come up soon that will help to stop this, and potentially if this ceasefire proposal has any traction at all, that would be welcome. And hopefully a deal in Gaza would also, I think, be welcomed by most people in the region.
Heathcliff O'Malley and Adrian Blomfield, thank you very much. I'll just remind listeners, for context, we are speaking on the morning of Thursday, the 26th. It will be about 24 hours before you hear this podcast, so things may have moved very, very quickly indeed. Adrian and Heathcliff, thank you so much for joining us. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all our news, analysis and dispatches from the ground in Israel and Gaza, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we're relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Battle Lines' sister podcast, Ukraine, the Latest. This episode of Battle Lines was produced by David Dargahi and executive produced by Louisa Wells and David Knowles.